One claims it's the company's only chance for survival.
Atari has filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The 31-year-old
AWA presents the difference. Kodak is filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection.
What's up, guys? My name is Jake, and welcome to the 33rd episode of Bankrupt. Years ago, I came across the ruins of a former chain restaurant in southern New Jersey, a rather eerie abandoned building that seemed like it was from a different time. Indeed it was, as I later found out that it was a former Lone Star Steakhouse, a long-defunct restaurant chain that is rarely talked about or even remembered. But that's kind of strange given how prosperous it once was, with tens of thousands of employees, hundreds of locations, and even being considered a Wall Street darling for a short time. So today, let's discover what happened to this brand and how it ultimately declared bankruptcy. It began with a man named Jamie B. Coulter, an entrepreneur from Wichita, Kansas, looking to get into the restaurant business. After driving delivery trucks through the early 1960s, he began opening franchises under the relatively new Pizza Hut Corporation. Through the 60s and the 70s, Coulter would open more than 170 locations, becoming the largest Pizza Hut franchisee. After some corporate restructuring by the 1980s, he then encountered a company called Creative Culinary Concepts, a corporation co-run by Dennis Thompson and Jim Verney, and one that was trying to create the next big restaurant brand. They had already spent years testing out various Texas Roadhouse-themed restaurants, and in 1989, they had opened Lone Star Steakhouse and Saloon in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Coulter was then shown this new restaurant brand, and was already immediately interested. He knew that both casual corporate restaurant chains were on the rise, as well as unique themed dining experiences that set themselves apart from others. So clearly there was a literal appetite, specifically for casual steakhouses in America. And by 1991, Coulter signed an agreement to develop and open another 4 restaurants by the following year. These brand new 6,000 square foot, 200 seat restaurants proved to be very successful with their wooden floors and corrugated tin partitions, along with a whole lot of Texas paraphernalia. These were highly themed restaurants and a welcoming place for many. In fact, they kept things so casual that when their signature buckets of peanuts were delivered to your table, you were encouraged to just throw the shells on the floor. With praising reviews for the quality and pricing of their food, the brand was proving to be a big hit. Coulter would then go all in on this concept, ultimately incorporating the company and making himself CEO and president. The executives from Creative Culinary would stay on, but only in minor roles as they continue to operate their own firm. By this point, Lone Star, with just a handful of locations, was already making $1.3 million in income on sales of over $11 million. Pretty good. The steady growth of sales was very encouraging, and Coulter, seeing its potential, wanted to expand. But first, he needed capital, and to do this, he looked to Wall Street, since several other restaurant brands were seeing great success in the stock markets. So, in March of 1992, he took the brand public, and immediately, there was a ton of interest. With their stock price shooting up following their IPO, Lone Star would raise more than $18 million in a single day, and another $41 million by the end of the year. Coulter now had the cash allowing them to expand. And oh boy, expanding is what he did. In just 3 years, Lone Star Steakhouse would open a truly insane 174 restaurants. This brought their total to 182 locations across 33 states by 1995. This was an enormous rise for the brand, and the increasing income from their inflating stock price just continued to fuel their expansion desires. Lone Star Steakhouse was nothing more than a tremendous success, with Fortune magazine ranking it 6 out of the 100 fastest growing companies in the country, with Forbes likewise calling it the best small company in America for 3 consecutive years. And it's easy to see why. By this point, the company was posting annual sales of $340 million. A tremendously successful run for a restaurant brand that barely existed just 5 years prior. 1995 was also the same year that the original company which launched the brand, Creative Culinary Concepts, would officially be bought out by Lone Star, those original founders now receiving larger stakes in the company. Pun definitely intended. Aside from the buyout, Lone Star would also begin developing and acquiring other restaurant concepts, notably Sullivan's, a 1940s themed upscale establishment which would first open in Austin, Texas. This was on top of Del Frisco's, another upscale steakhouse. While all of this was happening, Coulter continued to grow Lone Star, setting a goal to ultimately bring the brand to $1 billion in annual sales. And it did seem like that was a very real possibility. Wall Street had eaten up their stock, growing their share price to over $40. That's over 1,000% increase in just 4 years. The company would also expand internationally to other countries and territories like Guam and Australia. While stores continued to open, however, investor sentiment was beginning to sour, as analysts began seeing potential cracks forming in the future market and growth opportunities the company had been on track with. With higher food and labor costs, along with fears of market saturation, their stock price would drop by more than half of its value by 1997. And it wasn't long before those analysts' fears began to become reality, as same-store sales began to fall behind expectations. Confidence in the brand quickly dropped off once again, shooting the stock to just $6 a share by 1998, nearly an 86% drop in just 2 years. This completely killed off the expansion momentum the brand had been leading with. By that same year, the company only opened 2 locations and actually closed restaurants by 1999. But still, the brand was pretty massive, operating 14 Sullivan restaurants, 3 Del Frisco locations, and 265 Lone Star Steakhouses, including another 33 locations in other countries. While the company was still earning money, its overall net income was on the decline. As a result, restaurants continued to close through 2000. But that's not to say people didn't like the chain anymore. Lone Star continued to receive positive reviews, and many locations were still successful establishments. Revenue by this point was over $575 million, and income had recovered a bit, as did their stock price. However, following a small corporate structure spat, it seems like corporate leadership was done with dealing with Wall Street and the ebbs and flows of their stock price. It seems that the overall executive sentiment was to take themselves private. But in order to do that, they would need to find private money. By March 2002, the company announced their intentions to be acquired by a private equity firm, a deal that was worth around $580 million, but also one that would ultimately fall through. While executives publicly stated that they would not seek out another buyer, the company would instead focus on growth once again. This time very calculated and slow growth, opening just a handful of locations through the early 2000s. Profits and overall sales during this time stayed pretty consistent, trending up year after year, a very positive sign for the brand. Ultimately, though, yet another buyer would come in, yet another private equity firm, though this one with a very appropriate name. Lone Star Funds, a Dallas-based firm, announced that they would be acquiring the restaurant company for $613 million, and by doing so, subsequently take it private. Coulter would also step down as CEO, and their new private owners then set out to try and fix the chain, one that was now made up of around 182 locations and around 17,000 employees. Lone Star would see updating of their menu as well as the design of their locations. They had continued the implementation of the urban style remodels they had started back in 2004. The idea was to update all aspects of the consumer experience and operational efficiency of the brand. This also meant that more restaurants would close. In typical private equity fashion, plans were also put in place to sell real estate and lease it back to themselves, and also to franchise out locations so that they were no longer corporately owned. Critics might call that another way of stripping the company of value and saddling an already struggling chain with even more debt. But regardless, and despite the 2008 recession, that's exactly what they did. More locations would close through the rough financial turndown, mostly in Florida, leaving 1,500 employees without a job. The fallout of the recession had lasting impacts beyond this one chain, as casual restaurants across the board saw diner traffic fall, many of which then seen subsequent financial declines. Since Lone Star was now private, we don't exactly know what their finances looked like. However, their CEO did come out and say, in response to their current outlook, that, quote, "In the lifespan of casual dining, we haven't seen economic times like this." He did, however, add that, quote, "We're gonna get through this, but it won't be easy." Still though, Lone Star continued to shutter locations, now bringing their store count to under 100 by 2014. It seems that any enthusiasm for the brand by this point was mostly gone. Lone Star Steakhouse now had a dwindling customer base as well as a dwindling restaurant presence, many of which were painfully bland, modern examples of uninspired, boring chain restaurants in America. Lone Star no longer provided a unique experience. It was now a generic, Texas-adjacent style casual chain steakhouse that served increasingly more expensive and bland food options. They also had a lot of direct competition, some chain restaurants like Longhorn Steakhouse having nearly an identical menu. Its ever-declining presence across America meant that their overall profits as a chain were likely in a steep decline, likely causing their parent company to lose interest and faith in the dying brand. Lone Star funds likely wanted out of their investment, and by 2015, the bleeding steakhouse brand was essentially spun off, though technically it was acquired by a new private holding company that was more or less created just for this by former Lone Star executives. This acquisition, while seeming like a classic death notice, also came with some positive outlooks by executives, their CEO claiming to believe strongly in the growth potential for their brand. While this was all well and good, things were clearly not being turned around. Following the rather abrupt exit of those executives, locations just continued to shutter. Through 2016, Lone Star Steakhouse would be reduced to just 16 operating locations. And by that point, I think everyone knew the writing was on the wall. By 2016, at least 14 of those remaining locations would abruptly close down. Finally, though, on February 13th, 2017, and with very little press, Lone Star Steakhouse would file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. This Chapter 11 filing was rather short-lived, though, as by the end of that year, they would ultimately convert to Chapter 7, meaning instead of trying to restructure, the entire chain would instead permanently shut down. Through 2018 and 2019, the few final holdout locations would begin to shutter one by one. As their website went offline, and with very poor reviews by the end, in October of 2019, the final Lone Star Steakhouse in North America, a location in Knightdale, North Carolina, would close permanently. In the end, Lone Star was just about as corporate as you can get with a casual American restaurant brand. Remember, this company started with someone who was looking to try something new in the restaurant business after already building a successful franchise empire. Lone Star Steakhouse was the culmination of years of trial and error with another company which had been testing concepts. And not to be too cynical, but this brand was the chemical makeup that just happened to get the formula right. Once the test locations brought in money, everyone saw dollar signs and capitalized not only on the well-received brand name, but the overall rise in casual chain restaurants across America, especially in the niche steak market. Now, that's not to say there's anything wrong with any of this, but Lone Star certainly wasn't the invention of a small family who loved the craft of cooking and took it nationwide. No, it was always supposed to be something that was supposed to be a chain brand. I think in the early days of this company, there was a lot of charm to what they were doing. But as years went on and they minimalized their brand aesthetic and was bought out by private equity, their whole public presence was extremely bland. Just look at a commercial towards the end.
Oh, I love that glaze.
So eventually, I think consumers just got sick of steakhouse chain restaurants. I know this Bankrupt episode is kind of the trifecta of everything that goes wrong in these stories. We have the 2008 recession and we have them being bought out by private equity. But Lone Star also failed to adapt in both their own locations, many of them unchanged from the 2004 renovations, some even from the 90s, but also in their diversification. Lone Star had other brands, but they were also all steakhouse focused, with minor variations of the style in which they were serving. By comparison, their competitors like Longhorn Steakhouse and Outback Steakhouse, well, they both had parent companies that had various other brands serving different markets in the restaurant business, heavily diversifying their portfolio, thus keeping them alive. Lone Star as a collective company focused almost entirely on steaks, and in the end, there seemed to be figuratively and literally no appetite by their private equity owners to actually put in the work to save the brand. And now, well, nobody seems to really care. Despite this once being a pretty large company in America, its demise is barely talked about, and the brand today has almost completely disappeared. All that's left are the memories of those who visited and worked there, along with the various physical, often abandoned restaurants, which if you do a quick search of, seems to be no shortage of. I myself came across one back in July of 2019. It was a location in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, a restaurant that was opened back in 1985 and likely closed during the recession in 2008. This was one of the stores that didn't receive the 2004 renovation, as its interiors retained the classic 90s aesthetic. Amazingly, when I visited, almost everything remained largely as it was, with the dining room full of tables and chairs, many of which turned over and disheveled, with booths torn up, now growing mold. The classic Old West murals remained on the walls, while the various props and framed Texas Americana posters had all been staged in a corner. While small fragments of the restaurant seem nostalgic, almost like you can picture a dining room full of patrons, the reality was a lot more distant and bleak. The building was a mess, pitch black from the boards over the windows, and the interior drop ceiling torn down and apart. Even in the back rooms, full kitchen equipment remained as they were, while within the large industrial refrigerators, plates sat neatly stacked atop rusting steel shelves, as did the various leftover food items, some even unopened. Even full bottles of liquor were all left behind. It was truly a revolting mess back here that you couldn't stand inside for more than a few minutes without a mask. This really was a physical representation of the fall of Lone Star. Today, this restaurant building still stands, though now more secured and even listed for rent. But that isn't to say that the brand itself is gone forever. Yes, there are a million similarly named restaurants everywhere, but that Lone Star Steakhouse name and brand, well, despite its closure across North America and Australia, if you might remember, they also operated a location on the island of Guam. After that location was purchased by an independent restaurant operator in 2002, it seemed to have slipped through the bankruptcy cracks, and even today, still operates. Even after a recent facade change, it still retains the original 90s interior, which I think is pretty cool. So after all of that, its rapid and lucrative rise to its gradual and uneventful bankruptcy, you could in fact still dine in this forgotten restaurant brand in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to both this channel, Brights on Films, or my second travel review channel, Brights on Travels. If you want to support my work further, I also have a Patreon page where you can get all types of exclusive perks, chief of which getting your name at the end of each video and seeing these videos early. Anyway guys, my name is Jake, and thank you very much for watching.